The morning of May 10, 1940 broke over the Ardennes Forest with an eerie stillness that would soon be shattered forever. French sentries stationed along the supposedly impenetrable wooded hills sipped their coffee, confident in the natural fortress that stretched before them. Their commanders had assured them that no modern army could push through such terrain with any meaningful force. Tanks simply couldn't navigate those dense woods and steep ravines. It was military gospel, written in every strategic manual from Paris to London. They were about to learn how catastrophically wrong military gospel could be. Heinz Guderian stood in the command vehicle, his map spread before him like a chessboard, where he'd already calculated victory 10 moves ahead. At 51 years old, he cut an imposing figure, not through physical stature, but through an intensity that seemed to radiate from his very being. His eyes, sharp behind round spectacles, traced the routes his panzer divisions would take. Around him, younger officers shifted nervously. What they were about to attempt defied every convention of warfare that had governed military thinking since men first organized themselves into armies. The previous war, the Great War, had been a nightmare of static positions and grinding attrition. Guderian had seen it firsthand, watching men throw themselves against machine gun nests and barbed wire, gaining meters at the cost of thousands of lives. He had watched the flower of European youth ground into the mud of Verdun in the Somme, and he had made himself a promise: never again. There had to be a better way. There had to be a way to win wars through speed and shock rather than through the slow arithmetic of death. But the promise of one young officer meant nothing against the inertia of military tradition. After the war, while other nations celebrated their victory and Germany nursed its humiliation, Guderian began to study. He devoured everything he could find about tanks, those mechanical monsters that had appeared late in the previous conflict. Most generals saw them as mere infantry support, slow-moving fortresses meant to help foot soldiers cross no man's land. Guderian saw something else entirely. He saw speed, he saw breakthrough, he saw the future. The problem was convincing anyone else. In the 1920s and early 1930s, as Germany secretly rebuilt its military in violation of the Versailles Treaty, Guderian found himself fighting a war on two fronts, one against Germany's enemies and one against his own high command. Traditional cavalry officers dismissed him as an upstart technician. Infantry generals couldn't imagine warfare that didn't revolve around the foot soldier. Even tank enthusiasts often missed his central insight. Guderian's revelation was deceptively simple. Don't spread tanks out to support infantry. Mass them together. Concentrate them into entire divisions of armor, supported by their own motorized infantry and artillery, all moving at the same speed. And most crucially, give them close air support from dive bombers that could act as flying artillery, smashing enemy positions just ahead of the advancing tanks. It was combined arms warfare, but not as anyone had conceived it before. The traditional approach was to have different military branches cooperate, yes, but still operating at different speeds, different rhythms. Infantry moved at a walking pace. Artillery took hours to set up. Cavalry could move quickly but was vulnerable. Guderian's vision was to synchronize everything to move at the speed of the tank, creating an armored fist that could punch through enemy lines before they even understood they were under attack.
His superiors thought he was mad. Tank fanatic, they called him, and not affectionately. Some wanted him dismissed from service entirely. But Guderian had an advantage that most visionaries lack. He was a brilliant teacher and writer. His book, Achtung Panzer, published in 1937, laid out his theories with such clarity and force that it began to win converts. More importantly, it caught the attention of Adolf Hitler, who understood instinctively that Germany couldn't win another war of attrition. Germany needed something revolutionary. Hitler gave Guderian his chance, but it came with impossible pressure. The German High Command, the OKH, remained skeptical. Many senior generals were actively hostile to his ideas. When planning began for the invasion of France, the initial strategy was conventional, a repeat of the old Schlieffen plan, swinging through Belgium. It would work, probably, but it would be slow, costly, and give the Allies time to respond. Guderian looked at the maps and saw the Ardennes. Everyone said it was impossible. The forest was too thick, the roads too narrow, the terrain too difficult. Allied intelligence was certain the Germans wouldn't try it, which meant, Guderian realized, that it was exactly where they should attack. But he needed more than just to get through the Ardennes. He needed to cross the Meuse River on the other side, smash through the French positions, and then race to the English Channel before the Allies could react. It required perfect coordination between tanks, infantry, engineers, and the Luftwaffe. It required his forces to move faster than the enemy could think, faster than their command structure could respond, faster than seemed humanly possible. It required Blitzkrieg. The term itself, lightning war, wasn't actually Guderian's invention, and he never particularly liked it. It was coined by a journalist and had a flashy quality that seemed to trivialize the careful thinking behind it. But the name stuck because it captured something essential about what Guderian had created: warfare as a bolt from the blue, sudden and devastating. Now, on this May morning, all the theories and arguments and training exercises were about to face their ultimate test. Guderian's IX Panzer Corps, consisting of over 800 tanks and thousands of vehicles, was poised to enter the Ardennes. If he was wrong, if the forest proved impassable, if the French responded quickly, his entire force could be trapped and destroyed. The Wehrmacht would be crippled. Germany would lose the war before it truly began. The order came: forward. What happened next would rewrite every military manual in existence. The panzers moved into the forest in a massive column that stretched for miles. Contrary to Allied assumptions, Guderian had carefully planned routes through the Ardennes, using reconnaissance and detailed maps. Where roads didn't exist, engineers rapidly cleared paths. Where bridges couldn't support the weight of tanks, they laid temporary spans. The entire operation moved with a precision that seemed choreographed, but it was the result of endless training and planning. French reconnaissance aircraft spotted the massive traffic jam snaking through the forest. Pilots returned with reports of the huge German concentration, but their commanders didn't believe them. The Germans couldn't possibly be moving their main force through the Ardennes. It must be a feint, a diversion. The real attack would come through Belgium, as it had in 1914. This disbelief was precisely what Guderian had counted on. He understood something profound about modern warfare. It wasn't just about firepower. It was about getting inside the enemy's decision-making cycle. If you could move faster than your opponent could observe, analyze, decide, and act, you could paralyze them. They would always be responding to where you were, not where you are, let alone where you're going to be. By May 13th, Guderian's forces had emerged from the Ardennes and reached the Meuse River at Sedan. The French had fortifications here, but they were designed to withstand a conventional assault, massed artillery preparation over days, then infantry attacks. They weren't prepared for what Guderian unleashed. Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the sky in carefully coordinated waves, their sirens adding psychological terror to the physical destruction of their bombs. The Luftwaffe had been training for exactly this mission: close air support for rapidly advancing ground forces. As the Stukas pounded French positions, Guderian's artillery opened up. Then, even before the bombardment fully lifted, assault boats carrying German infantry pushed across the river. French defenders fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by the speed and violence of the assault. Before their commanders in the rear even understood what was happening, German engineers were constructing pontoon bridges across the Meuse. By evening, the first tanks were rolling across. This was the critical moment. Guderian knew that the French would counterattack. Standard military doctrine said I should pause, consolidate my bridgehead, build up forces, and then advance cautiously. His own superiors ordered him to do exactly this. They were terrified that he was moving too fast, that he would be cut off and destroyed. Guderian ignored them. He understood in modern warfare, audacity was safer than caution. The French were confused. Their command structure was reeling from the speed of events. If he gave them time to recover, they would hit him with everything they had. But if he kept moving, kept the pressure on, they never regained their balance. He ordered his panzers to push westward toward the Channel coast immediately. When his superiors sent increasingly frantic messages to slow down, he claimed radio problems prevented him from receiving orders. When they sent officers to physically deliver commands to halt, he was mysteriously always at the front, unreachable. Later, historians would call this reconnaissance in force or leading from the front, but their staff knew the truth. Their general was deliberately making himself unavailable to receive orders he had no intention of following. The panzers raced westward. French and British forces tried to respond, but Guderian was always ahead of them. When they rushed forces to block one route, his tanks had already taken another. When they prepared defensive positions, the Germans were already behind them. The Allies' entire command structure, built around careful planning and methodical operations, simply couldn't keep up with the pace of the advance. Inside the advancing panzer columns, the pace was exhausting. Tank crews fought and drove for days with minimal sleep. Infantry and half-tracks struggled to keep up. Supply trucks raced forward along roads clogged with refugees fleeing the onslaught. Guderian himself moved constantly between his units in a command vehicle equipped with radio, coordinating the advance, solving problems, pushing his men beyond what they thought possible. But he also understood the human element of warfare in a way many commanders didn't. He made sure his men had hot food when possible. He visited units personally, showing himself to the soldiers, letting them see that their general shared their risks. When tanks broke down, he ensured recovery crews were immediately available. When units got separated in the rapid advance, he had clear rally points and communication protocols.
Most importantly, he trusted his subordinate commanders. Blitzkrieg required initiative at every level. Tank company commanders couldn't wait for orders from above when opportunities appeared. They had to assess situations and act immediately. Guderian had spent years training officers to think this way, to understand the overall mission and then execute it using their own judgment. Now that training paid off as German units repeatedly outmaneuvered Allied forces through quick, decentralized decision-making. By May 20th, just 10 days after the offensive began, Guderian's forces reached the English Channel at Abbeville. They had driven nearly 250 miles through enemy territory, cutting off the entire British Expeditionary Force and the best French armies in Belgium. It was a military achievement without precedent in modern history. The Allies were stunned. How had this happened? Their armies were larger, their tanks in many cases superior in armor and armament. The French had more tanks than the Germans. British and French soldiers fought bravely throughout the campaign, yet they had been decisively defeated in a matter of days. The answer lay in Guderian's revolutionary approach to warfare. It wasn't about having better weapons, it was about using combined arms in a synchronized way that created effects far beyond the sum of the parts. Tanks provided mobility and firepower. Motorized infantry could exploit breakthroughs the tanks created. Artillery moved with the advance, providing fire support when needed. Dive bombers acted as precision artillery that could strike anywhere within hours. Engineers bridged obstacles. Signals units maintained communications. Supply troops kept everything moving. But even more fundamentally, Blitzkrieg was about tempo. Guderian had created a way of fighting that operated inside the enemy's decision-making cycle. By the time French commanders understood where the Germans were and decided on a response, Guderian's forces had already moved to a new position. Traditional military hierarchies, with their careful planning and approval processes, simply couldn't function at the speed the battle now required.
There's a moment in combat, familiar to anyone who has studied martial arts or competitive sports, when you achieve what athletes call flow state. Your opponent seems to move in slow motion. You're not reacting to their moves, you're anticipating them, already responding to what they're about to do before they do it. Guderian had created the same effect at the strategic level. The German army was in flow state, and the Allies were drowning. Of course, the story of the fall of France is more complex than just Guderian's actions. Other German forces were engaged elsewhere. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Allied leadership made critical mistakes. There were political factors and morale issues. History is never just about one person or one innovation. But Guderian's breakthrough at Sedan and the race to the Channel demonstrated a new form of warfare so effective that it would influence military thinking for generations. After France fell and Britain evacuated its army from Dunkirk, military academies around the world scrambled to understand what had happened. How had the seemingly impossible become inevitable? The Germans continued to use Blitzkrieg tactics when they invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, achieving massive initial successes. But here, Guderian's methods met their limits. The vast spaces of Russia absorbed the German thrusts. Soviet commanders learned to trade space for time, falling back rather than allowing themselves to be encircled. The harsh Russian winter stopped the panzers where French fortifications had failed, and perhaps most importantly, the Soviets adapted, learning to mass their own armor and conduct mobile warfare. Guderian himself had a complicated relationship with the Nazi regime. He was not politically naive, he knew what kind of government he served, yet he focused on his military role, perhaps using this as a way to avoid confronting the larger moral questions about the war he was helping Germany wage. This is one of the uncomfortable truths about military innovation. Brilliant tactical and operational thinking doesn't exist in a moral vacuum. Guderian's methods helped Nazi Germany conquer much of Europe, enabling atrocities and suffering on a massive scale. After the war, during his interrogation by Allied officers, Guderian was asked if he had any regrets. He responded that his only regret was that his methods hadn't been fully adopted earlier and more completely. He seemed to view warfare as a technical problem, divorced from its human consequences. This separation of means from ends, of tactical brilliance from strategic and moral wisdom, is a danger that exists in any field of human endeavor. Yet we cannot deny the profound impact of his innovations. Modern militaries around the world still study Blitzkrieg. The emphasis on combined arms operations, on speed and tempo, on decentralized decision-making, on getting inside the enemy's decision cycle, these principles are foundational to contemporary military doctrine. The U.S. military's air-land battle doctrine of the 1980s and its successor concepts all trace their lineage back to Guderian's insights. Even beyond military applications, there are lessons here for anyone facing competitive challenges. Guderian succeeded because he questioned assumptions everyone else took for granted. The Ardennes was impassable only if you accepted traditional definitions of passable. Tanks were infantry support weapons only if you thought about them conventionally. You had to consolidate gains before advancing only if you followed peacetime logic rather than understanding the psychology of disruption. He also understood that in any competitive domain, tempo matters enormously. Being slightly better isn't as valuable as being much faster. If you can act while your competitors are still analyzing, if you can be implementing your next move while they're still responding to your last one, you create a compound advantage that can overcome deficits in resources or position. But perhaps the deepest lesson is about the integration of different capabilities. Guderian didn't invent tanks or motorized infantry or dive bombers or radio communications. All these elements existed before him. His genius was seeing how they could work together in a new way, synchronized to operate at the same tempo, each element amplifying the others. Innovation isn't always about creating something entirely new, but about combining existing elements in ways no one has tried before. Standing in that command vehicle on May 10, 1940, Guderian couldn't have known how his actions that day would ripple through history. He couldn't have foreseen that military academies would study his campaigns decades later, that his name would become synonymous with a revolution in warfare, that the tactics he proved that day would influence conflicts from the deserts of Iraq to the jungles of Vietnam. All he knew was that ahead lay the forest everyone said was impassable, the river everyone said couldn't be quickly crossed, the enemy everyone said would stop him. And he knew that speed, properly applied, could transform impossible into inevitable. As the first tanks rolled into the Ardennes, their tracks churning up the soft earth, their engines roaring defiance at conventional wisdom, a new age of warfare began. It would be an age of speed and shock, of combined arms and coordinated strikes, of battles decided not who had more men or more guns, but who could think and move faster than their opponent could react. Guderian had created this same effect at the strategic level. The German army was in flow state, and the Allies were drowning.
Up next, if you like content like this, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more.